Nobody was watching Ohtani in that moment. For once. That detail alone makes the story unusual. Because in every stadium the Dodgers enter, in every practice session and warm-up and dugout exchange, there are always eyes on Ohtani. Cameras find him instinctively. Teammates glance toward him. Opponents track him even when he's standing still. It is the particular gravity of his presence, this unavoidable pull that his existence on a baseball field creates in everyone around him. But in that moment, nobody was watching him. Because everybody was watching Miguel Rojas. Rojas had gone down in a way that made the entire dugout go quiet. Not the loud, dramatic quiet of a crowd holding its breath. The specific, cold quiet of people who understand baseball well enough to recognize when something is genuinely wrong. He hadn't been hit by a pitch. He hadn't collided with another player. It was the kind of injury that sometimes looks minor from a distance and turns out to be anything but. The kind that arrives without warning and without a clear cause and sits in that frightening middle ground between serious and catastrophic until someone with knowledge assesses it properly. The training staff was moving. Teammates were rising from the bench. Cameras were zooming toward the infield where Rojas had stopped. And in the middle of all of that organized concern, before the trainer had fully crossed the foul line, before the manager had reached the top step, Shohei Ohtani and Yoshinobu Yamamoto were already there. Crouched beside him. Hands moving with a calm and a purpose that stopped several people in their tracks. Miguel Rojas would later say, voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude, that he didn't think Ohtani was so good at first aid. And that if it weren't for him and Yamamoto, the story might have ended very differently. Rojas is not a player who asks for help easily. That is important context. He is a veteran in the fullest sense of the word, a shortstop who has built his career not on spectacular athleticism but on something harder to quantify and more difficult to sustain. Intelligence. Preparation. The kind of quiet leadership that doesn't announce itself but holds a clubhouse together in ways that never appear in a box score. He has played through discomfort before. He has made the calculation that most veteran players make, the one where you weigh what the team needs against what your body is telling you and sometimes choose the team. He is not dramatic about his physical state. He doesn't broadcast pain. So when Rojas went down and stayed down, the people who know him understood immediately that this was real. This was not a precautionary pause. This was something that had his full, undivided, involuntary attention. He would describe it later as a sharp, specific sensation that arrived without warning and radiated in a direction he didn't like. The kind of pain that creates instant uncertainty about what comes next. About whether next means later that inning or next week or something longer and more complicated. In those first seconds on the ground, Rojas admitted, his mind went to a place that athletes try never to visit. The injured list. The timeline. The return. Everything that disappears when your body decides to have a conversation you weren't ready for. Ohtani reached him before he'd finished processing any of that. Rojas would later say he was still trying to assess his own situation, trying to determine through the fog of sudden pain exactly what he was dealing with, when he became aware of a presence beside him. He turned his head slightly. And there was Ohtani, crouched low, already asking something through his expression that his limited English and Rojas's limited Japanese made difficult to translate into words. But the hands communicated clearly. Ohtani's hands moved with a confidence and a gentleness that Rojas described as immediately calming. Not aggressive. Not uncertain. Purposeful. He touched the area Rojas was guarding with an instinctive protectiveness, applied a specific, measured pressure, and assessed something. The way someone assesses something when they know what they're looking for. Yamamoto arrived seconds later. And what happened next was conducted almost entirely in a language that wasn't English and wasn't baseball. It was something older and more fundamental. Two people helping a third. Quietly. Efficiently. Without performance or hesitation. The trainer arrived to find Rojas already slightly more composed than he had been 30 seconds earlier. Already breathing differently. already less in the grip of that first terrifying wave of not knowing. And the trainer, who would later acknowledge what he found when he got there, looked briefly at Ohtani with an expression that asked a question without words. Ohtani simply moved aside. Let the professional take over. Said nothing about what he'd done. Went back to the dugout like nothing had happened. It was weeks later, during a media session that had started as routine, that Rojas brought it up himself. Nobody prompted him. Nobody asked specifically about that moment. A reporter had asked a general question about team chemistry, about what makes this particular Dodgers group different from other rosters Rojas had been part of. He answered thoughtfully, talking about preparation and professionalism and the standard that the organization maintains. And then he paused. And something shifted in his expression. The practiced, media-trained composure softened into something more unguarded. There's something I want to say, he began. Something I haven't talked about publicly. The reporters in the room adjusted. Leaned slightly forward in the way people do when they sense something real is coming. Rojas looked down at the table for a moment. Then back up. When I went down out there, he stopped. Started again. I didn't know how bad it was. In those first few seconds, you don't know. You're just in it. And before anyone else got to me, Shohei was there. And Yoshi. He shook his head slightly. Not in disbelief. In something closer to lingering wonder. I didn't think he was so good at first aid. I genuinely did not know that about him. And in that moment, it mattered more than I can really explain. The room stayed with him. Nobody rushed to ask a follow-up. Because Rojas wasn't finished, and everyone could tell. What he did, what they both did, it was calm. It was specific. It wasn't just two guys coming over to pat my shoulder and look concerned. They were doing something. Ohtani especially. He knew where to put his hands. He knew how much pressure to apply. He spoke to Yoshi in Japanese and Yoshi said something back and they made a decision together about what to do before the trainer even arrived. Rojas paused again. I think if they hadn't stabilized what they stabilized in those first seconds, if I'd moved wrong, tried to get up too fast, it could have been significantly worse. The trainer said as much afterward. He said whatever had been done in those first moments had helped. His voice was steady but carried weight. The weight of someone describing a debt that can't quite be fully repaid. I might have ended up on the injured list. The timeline could have looked very different. And instead, I was back within days. I think about that. He looked directly at the reporters. I think about who was there first. And why that matters. When Ohtani was asked about it, his response was characteristically understated. He listened to the question through his interpreter, nodded once while it was being translated, and then answered in the measured way he always answers personal questions. As though the experience belongs more to the person it happened to than to him. As though his role in it was simply what anyone would have done. I was close when it happened, he said quietly. I just went to him. You go to your teammate. He paused. In Japan, we learned some of these things. First response. How to help before help arrives. I learned it seriously when I was younger. I never thought about using it here. He said nothing else about it. Didn't elaborate on where he'd learned it or how rigorously he'd pursued that knowledge or what specifically he'd done when he reached Rojas. Just, I learned it when I was younger. I went to my teammate. The simplicity of it was somehow more striking than any detailed explanation could have been. Because it revealed something about how Ohtani organizes his understanding of himself and his responsibilities. The first aid knowledge wasn't something he'd filed away as a curiosity or a hobby. It was something he carried. Something he considered part of what it means to be prepared. To be, in the fullest possible sense, ready for whatever a day might require. Yamamoto, when asked separately, smiled in that quiet way he has. He is not a player who seeks attention even when attention is available to him. He spoke briefly, carefully, in a way that honored what had happened without overstating his own contribution. Shohei knew what to do, Yamamoto said simply. I followed his lead. When Shohei moves with that kind of certainty, you trust it. He thought for a moment. Rojas-san is important to this team. Important to how we play. I think we were both just glad we could help. He left it at that. But the phrase stayed. When Shohei moves with that kind of certainty, you trust it. It was an insight that applied to more than that moment on the infield grass. It applied to everything Ohtani does inside the lines and beyond them. The way he exists in this team and in this sport, with a completeness and a sureness that extends far beyond what anyone originally anticipated. Beyond batting and pitching. Beyond stats and records. Into the human spaces where teams actually become teams. Rojas returned to the lineup faster than the timeline initially suggested. He moved well. He played well. He said little about the injury except that he felt good and the team needed him and he was glad to be back. But in a quieter moment, away from the formal press availability, he said one more thing about Ohtani and Yamamoto. About those first minutes on the grass when everything was uncertain and two teammates arrived before anyone else. In this game, Rojas said, you learn quickly who shows up when it's easy. Everybody shows up when it's easy. Everybody claps after a home run. Everybody celebrates a win. He paused. But who shows up in the seconds when it's not easy? When it's just, someone is down, and something needs to be done, and nobody's sure what yet? He was quiet for a moment. I know who showed up for me. I won't forget it. And that was the whole story. Not the injury. Not the recovery. Not the first aid technique applied correctly under pressure. The story was simpler and more permanent than any of those things. Two teammates moved toward their fallen teammate before anyone else did. Before the cameras found the moment. Before the protocol kicked in. Before the world was watching. They just moved. Because that is what you do. And Shohei Ohtani, who already carried more expectations than any player in the history of this sport, apparently also carries this. The knowledge of how to help. And the instinct to use it.